Hello, guys. Nice to see you. Good evening. I'm calling in from Berlin. It's a bit unfortunate that we cannot see each other in person this time around, but hopefully we'll make this worthwhile. Yeah, my name is Kandel. I work at Zalando. I lead a team called AppCraft Mobile. And for those who do not know about AppCraft, it's a backend driven mobile UI framework. Today, I'm gonna do something different that I usually do not do. Of course, I will go through the technicals, and then we'll jump into my personal opinion on the key things that I experience and maybe some takeaways that would be interesting for you. One thing that I want to say up front is there's been quite some interest in backend driven UI, and I can see that just watching Florian's talk before this one. If you haven't, I would recommend that because that gives a lot of primer to my talk, and because I also cannot go into the details too much. With that being said, the agenda is I'm going to introduce what AppCraft is for those who you don't know. Then we'll talk a little bit about what is backend driven UI because I want to demystify this. Lots of people have lots of different opinion on that. And of course, I will speak in the context of AppCraft. And then I will share you 5 interesting key points that I experienced. I hope I'm going to make this interesting, and I'm also mindful of the time. Great. So AppCraft is a framework. It's from Zalando. It doesn't have any business logic about Zalando, so it's a dependency, and you can attach it to any host app if you will. And it has 2 components to it. It has a native iOS framework and an Android framework. Both do the exact same thing given the same input, basically create a screen. Yeah, this is what I talked about. It's a framework that attaches to Zalando app. Now, there is the host app, and I call AppCraft client when I mean Android and iOS framework because they essentially have to do the same thing to produce the same thing. Now, as an AppCraft client, it only knows one thing, which is given a JSON description of the app, how do you produce a screen or UI view controller in iOS, in our case. So if you're coming from functional programming or if you're interested in that, it is kind of like a function, right? The framework, the input is a JSON description, output is a screen that you can, or UI view controller that you can embed somewhere. Basically, that's the entire job this framework does. Now, Zalando uses AppCraft to power its homepage. And if you are using Zalando app, the first thing you will see is AppCraft powered content. So that's great. The question is, what is the JSON description looks like and who provides this? Because nobody's going to hand type some JSON, right? It's ridiculous. Fortunately, that's where the backend comes in. And we have rendering engine for now, but I'm going to talk a little bit later about that part. First, let me go head on to what is a backend driven UI, because there are lots of companies and frameworks and people talking about backend driven UI as if it's the same thing, but they mean different things. So if you're coming from Florian talk, then he did talk about a little bit about the data parameterization. I will carry on over from there. Basically, in my point of view, right, backend driven UI is how much can you parameterize your mobile UI based for data, for design, for behavior. And there is a fourth point, which I will talk a little bit later. Now, keep in mind, there are 3 things: data, design, behavior. Any screen always has those 3 aspects. Now, if you look at a calculator app or a voice memo, a recorder app, right, it basically does not need any server. So you can remove the backend, it's just the client tab. Forget about that, let's move on, right? Now, one of my favorite app is OneFootball. I like football. The first news that you see here is Italy losing to Spain. I actually wanted some different outcome, but that's not something I can complain about. But the thing is, if you look at the tile, it has an image, a text, and a logo, and some time, and these are all data. If you were to look at the app today, you might have some different news, but the format would be the same, right? So basically, app makes a request to a REST endpoint, gets the data, and sticks it into this skeleton that it knows in the compile time. Now I can talk something very close to me, which is the Zalando Lounge app. That's another app from Zalando. It has a bunch of things and discounts. So basically what you're seeing is two brands, if you will, they are on discount. Now they do not look any different. They are different in the data they have. One has Jamie Oliver, another has Solomon. So it's a data parameterization again. And the third example that you see, it's a Zalando app. It's a product detail page. And you can see, you can go through this. You tap on a product and you will definitely go to a product detail page because that's something we need to show you. And it always starts with a big image, a little bit of product details and a recommendation. And you can see on this pant again. So this is data parameterization. Now let's move on to the design, right? Design is something Florian quoted quite nicely. He mentioned something like he doesn't want to work on a feature to move 5 pixel something by 5 pixel. One of the engineers in my team was saying, I don't want to work on a feature where I need to change the background of a view from blue to red, and it needs app release and a 3-week release process. Those things. Design talks about aesthetics. It also talks about layout. For example, background is aesthetic. And how do you position this text? Does it always have to be in the top? Can it be on the bottom? Can you have a video instead of an image? What if the text is 3-line? Do we need an image in this case? These are layout questions. And can we answer those? For example, this is powered by AppCraft. And I'm going to play a GIF here. And these are all powered by AppCraft. You can see some elements use a huge amount of text. In this case, you also see a behavior of accordion, a bunch of text. And these are similar, but also different. And this is where Backend Driven UI really shines. And this is the example of design parameterization, right? You can change the design on the fly. And I'm going to show you one more example here. So the first one does not look any closer to the second one. The second one does not look like anything like the third one, and the same for the fourth one. However, they are all built with the same components, and they are changed on the fly for each page that we tailor to. And now I come to this chart that I made for myself to understand what a backend driven UI is. So almost every single app does data parameterization, and we don't want to call that backend driven UI because it just happens to be that way. The second class is, can we add design parameterization on top of the data parameterization? So here you would think about position of the elements. And if you go a little bit forward, you can think about what are the subatomic things that I can compose around. And then the third item is, can you provide action and behavior? Can you describe those behavior from the backend? Like what happens when somebody taps? Do we need to track or do we need to deep link somewhere? So in a sense, AppCraft follows data design and behavior parameterization. I would not say we have full behavior parameterization, but we have a restricted set of actions that you can perform. And then the fourth class is, can you on the run describe in the runtime and inspect the variables and then decide something else? That's scripting language, right? And if you were to add that, which we don't want to, then you are very closer to a Firefox or Chrome or any web browser. Essentially, web browser are the best examples of complete backend-driven UI, right? So we also don't want to be a web browser, or we don't want to use WebView too much. I guess you would agree with that. So if somebody comes to you and say, hey, I have a backend-driven UI, you can ask them, what kind of parameterization do you support? And that would be a nice way of moving ahead the conversation. Now, let me go back to AppCraft, right? Why do we need it? At Zalando, our motto is to be the starting point for fashion. We want to engage, inspire, and provide fashion for you, for the customers, tailored to them, right? That means we have thousands of brands and thousands of content formats and new campaigns coming up, new sales going on, and they all need ever slight different variation of the same thing that we have today. And if you want to work on variants and make a new variant component all the time, fair point, but we don't have the capacity or the time, and it's we say, let's keep it open. That's why we need AppCraft to provide this flexibility to meet the needs of tomorrow, not just today. Now, you could also argue you need backend driven UI because you want to get the benefit of deploying a change real time, like I'm doing here, right? I'm changing this margin top from 16 to 32. The next step is git push and deploy, and then anybody that requests this thing will get that new thing. Backwards compatible. You don't have to wait for adoption. You can fix quickly, ship quickly, and evaluate quickly. And this is all fantastic. As an engineer, I'm not going into too much detail, but I do want to give you the highlights. How is it built? So we basically have 7 or 8 components within the AppCraft framework that I talked about. These are primitives, and we call them primitive for good reason. We don't want somebody to come into our backend and then try to construct a UI label. We say that to them, UI label is granted, you use it as it is, but we do not have a concept called a showstopper. That's something somebody has to compose using the primitives that we provide. And as you can see, there is this layout, which is if you're coming from web, it's like div. If you're coming from iOS, it's a UI view that can have subviews and layout them. So layout is the one that can have children. It's a non-terminal graph entity, if you will. And then the rest of the other primitives are terminal entities or leaf element. And every element shares the same structure, which is a type. Florian saw that as well. He had view stack. We don't. We just have layout. Second, how do you parameterize design or layout? We use Flexbox because the same response has to work exactly the same on iOS and Android. We basically say, hey, what's the common denominator? And even with the web, because it's the web engineer who are going to write this React component that powers apps. So we said, okay, Flexbox is a standard known model. Let's use that. So we use Flexbox. That's why you see this flex. The behavior parameterization comes in the form of events. We provide standard hooks from the UI elements, like when something was created, maybe when something was tapped. And then there are predefined actions that you can attach. Action is not an open field at the moment. Then props is something from React. We just borrowed it as is. It's a properties or a model, if you will. What are the model or what are the properties of this layout? For example, scrollable, right? You can have it true or false. If it's a true, maybe on the iOS side, we convert that into a UI collection view. If not, it's just a UI view. It's just an example in any case. So the same thing happens for label. In this case, it doesn't have children. It doesn't need events, so that's omitted out here. This is just explaining what I just basically explained about this structure repeats. In a sense, now if you want to construct some card like the one on the right, basically what you would need is you would need a layout that can capture a label in image, and then you would put that non-scrollable, maybe horizontal, and then put an image, put a label, and then an image, and then that's it. And then you can ship that. Of course, behaviors, I added behavior like what happens when you tap. In this case, it tracks and then it deep links to some other piece. Yeah, so as an engineer, you might be thinking the 7 primitives, they are done, they are dusted. What can we do more with this? Let me tell you, because these elements are used from bigger components, they are in essence reused a lot of times. Imagine the case that you can make label rendering, like say 5 milliseconds faster. That label is going to be used 1,000 times within the single page, or maybe spanning across different pages. You saved enormous amount of performance, may potentially battery savings as well, right? And the second thing is, since we don't use Swift UI at the moment, we have to do the diffing and efficient rendering on iOS and on Android. And you can think about the challenges that comes with trying to figure out what is the subset that changed when somebody taps on a wishlist icon. Okay, so now I'm going to brush aside and jump into the opinion part. I'm going to start with how it started, what has happened, and where we are. So that's just like the life cycle of AppCraft, if you will. So we didn't start AppCraft in the beginning thinking we would build AppCraft. We had no idea. Basically, 3 years ago, we set out to say, let's try to build infrastructure that can power our Zalando home to ship dynamic contents without releasing the app. Before AppCraft, we had TNA. If you know about it, maybe not, but it essentially did not have the concept of primitive. It had a concept of big blocks, like teaser was a thing statically hard-coded in the app. And say, for example, Nike comes in and say, hey, I don't want the image in the teaser, or I want the image, I want video instead of an image, then you would have to think, oh, okay, now we need to make app release. Let me create a variant and give it a version, and then ship it to the app, ship next release, wait for adoption, and then allow Nike to go use it. Right? There are numerous problems, and one of the biggest thing is how many variants could you be able to create? How many duplicated code would you be able to have? And the most important thing is, why would we need to make this change when somebody just wants to have image on the left side compared to the right side, or they just want to have yellow background color instead of a blue? That's the predominant question. And we started with React Native because, of course, everybody starts there. We give it a shot for 6 months, and we couldn't use our magic wand, and it didn't work very well. You can read more about on this blog that our engineer wrote about. We did one conference talk, we did one demo module, and it was hard. The one thing that I can say is, if you are going to use React Native, you better be prepared to invest a lot in the developer tooling within your domain, within your team. That is something we didn't have back in the day. So we stopped that. And then, okay, back to drawing board, right? So we were a 3 engineers team back in the time. And then we just did React Native. It didn't work, a little bit of gloom, but that's okay because we have time to explore. The good thing was, while doing React Native, our engineers were exposed to a declarative UI that React has, React model system. And then Object.io, these fantastic guys also came out with a video on Elm architecture using on iOS. And that was super interesting. So we're combining all those new architecture and paradigms that we learned. And then we didn't have any bounds. We had a problem we wanted to solve, have a better home experience, but we had no immediate goal. So we set out to do exploration. We gave a couple of shots, we tried a bunch of things, and one thing led to another. We did stumble onto something that is pretty powerful. The screenshot that I'm showing you is not reflective of the time period. What we ended up having is, we started a native iOS framework, we started a native Android framework. They both started using, we basically said we will allow people to compose. There is no way we can build these bigger things by ourselves. So we literally said, okay, let's just implement the bare minimums, like maybe label, image, and a layout. And let's see how far we can go with layout systems. How far can we parameterize on data, on design, and on actions as well, behaviors, right? In the same time, as the idea got a little bit mature, we started to see, okay, it can produce some product card, it can produce a list of things. So we were doing prototypes, and one after the other. It was a fast-moving small team. At the same time, our web guys picked up this thing because we needed a backend. It was backend driven. Somebody had to write this JSON. So that somebody thought, oh, hold on a second, I'm not going to write this entire JSON by my hand, and nobody's going to do that. So let us create a system, or UI, which is what you see is what you get UI, that actually allows somebody to drag and drop the primitives that are in the app and compose them as it would be composed on the app, and then also allow them to bind data. So for example, in this example, you can see we're creating a page. It has a bunch of properties on the right-hand side. You can select, edit, standard stuff, right? And the interesting thing is you can also bind data to it. We have a GraphQL API, and we are introspecting on that and trying to bind the data to the UI elements. And you can also do this for the actions and behaviors. And once that is done and dusted, if you were to look at the app, it would have more or less what you designed, right? And it is pretty powerful. It was pretty powerful, I must say, because we're working on a graph all the time. The problem is, how do you connect everything? So that is an example of a landing page we published a lot later after we started working on this. So that was nice. We got something cool. We got a product. We got a list of things we can show, and then it was pretty good. But it was not production ready, right? We just stumbled upon this, and then as we are, we like to think big, think high, more go out of the way. And of course, if you see these two pages are created by AppCraft way later, but you see there is this message that dare to think bigger. Of course, we thought a lot bigger. We thought we could replace entire Zalando app using AppCraft within 6 months, when we didn't even have a production ready page at that moment. So it was like a pretty big, ambitious goal we set out for ourselves, right? And this had two things. It was like going to the moon when you don't know how to fly or something like that. But what it did was everybody, 10 iOS, 10 Android engineers in the entire Zalando team gathered together, and they criticized AppCraft architecture. They suggested changes. They helped review the things. They also wrote a lot of technical documentation on where we need to improve. Of course, we couldn't see entire Zalando in AppCraft in 6 months. That was too ambitious for us. But we did have a fair shot of getting something out. And while this was going pretty nicely, I mean, ambition was not going to be met, but we were in the track. Pandemic came on, like the COVID-19 started. Everybody started working from home. Our organization changed, and to meet the demands of the current time, the business had to evolve. And then all of a sudden, the web editor that you saw it was decommissioned, right? And then the team is reduced just to the app team. There is no more web team, and there is no more backend team. And then a few key people started leaving because of different circumstances. And then we are left with, we are a backend driven mobile UI team. We had a big ambition, and now our backend is gone, right? This is the picture that we took before, at probably the glory time, I would say, or the biggest team size we had. 2 people are missing here. And then in a few months during the pandemic, after the decommissioning, that's what we are left with. And now everybody believed in this project so hard. And then think about, you have a pandemic, people are in different time zones, and then there is an org change, people are leaving, half of the team does not exist anymore. You feel sad. And the more you invest in the project, the more sad you feel, right? It's not, and it was hard for us, but we gathered, and then let's say struggled through this time. Now we need to find the backend. So web tool is gone. In Zalando, we have a rendering engine that's a platform that powers most of the web applications that you see in Zalando. It's a one hub. It's written in React, and it embodies the concept of React. And you have to write code, of course. We chose, okay, that's going to be our platform, our backend. However, we had to get somebody to write React code so that it can spit out the JSON that we needed. And if you know a little bit about React, it's basically, it has JSX that can convert to HTML, CSS. In app case, it would have to convert that JSX into JSON. And we did some pretty nice implementation there. I mean, big thanks to the rendering engine team as well. And now we went from no code to, okay, let's embrace code. The left-hand side you can see is the React component that kind of represents a showstopper, the yellow part on the right-hand side. And it's there are a lot of abstraction on the rendering engine side. And then it's a programmatic model, so you can have if condition, all those nice things. But at the end of the day, this is all converted into the JSON that describes the application. that you see on the right. Yeah, and then moving on, we moved to rendering engine, and then we finally were able to ship Zalando home, migrating from TNA last year in June during the peak of the COVID-19. Yeah, and then today, AppCraft powers home, a bunch of themed homes like sports, designer, fashion. There could be many I don't know about, campaigns, outfits, a bunch of landing pages like sustainability. There are also pages that we don't know about because somebody can come to rendering engine, create a page and deploy, and also dynamically create a deep link without even talking to us, right? And mostly people were leveraging AppCraft as a platform, and we find that as a success of the framework. Now, at least 20 teams have directly contributed to the backend code to deploy their app experiences. The challenging part is people do not come to you when things go right. They only, or most of the time, they come to you when things do not go the way they want it to go. And that happens a lot for a technology that was just created and that is evolving. And this is where our small team is always struggling to give support to the ever-growing amount of teams that want to use AppCraft. And there is also a question like, is AppCraft contribution open for app engineers or web engineers? And we know for a fact that app engineers, we cannot go to them and say, hey, can you write some React so that we can ship something? These are all the challenges that we have. Stability is another one. But let me come back to the last part, right? Which is, what are the key takeaways? I think every company wants to innovate. And in my belief or in my experience, you cannot roadmap or estimate or plan innovation by sprint, for example. Cliff had an analogy yesterday. If you want to grow a forest in a nice way, you do not go to each tree and talk about, okay, next quarter you need to grow by this amount, right? You let the forest, you provide good environment, what amount of rain, what amount of sun, when, wind, and then you let the trees do the work. And I think this is very important to innovation as well. You need to give a problem, environment, and space. And I was fortunate enough, we didn't plan this to turn out this way. Back in the time, it just happened that we had the right environment to do AppCraft. Coming back to implementation, I think composition is king. We only had 7 primitives, and to this day, we've reaped the benefit out of that. Because if you compose something out of those, there is no backwards compatibility issue. It just works for all the versions, like HTML works in a browser. So composition is great. Always think about that. I think aiming high is very good. Being ambitious is good, but not losing, being grounded and making progress at the same time is more important. The other one is, I was personally attached to the project, and when this reorg happened, it had a little bit knock-off effect on me. I had to go through a little bit hard time. I think personally being attached to a project is good in the beginning, but there comes a point where you have to say, okay, this is a project, and you have to not completely say this is my baby project or something like that. At least that's my opinion. It might be different for you. Yeah, and the last one is, when a product is used in mass, it then becomes really challenging to evolve. You can't break, because you are breaking customers' experience in this case. And evolution mostly, in the beginning, evolves around break and make. And that's not usually what happens. So after we ship home, we had to think a lot about, how do we make this stable? How do we make this robust? How do we make this resilient? All those things. And these are still the challenges we have today. And lastly, I'm almost at the end. I want to thank the MobiConf organizers for sending me this bunch of gift packet. My wife got to use them. She planted the seed. I think it was basil. She's very happy about it. I'm showing you 2 pictures. So thank you for that, and inviting me to talk to you here. Yeah, and we are hiring. I'm hiring actually for my team. And if you want to work in this pretty cool AppCraft system, please contact me or follow these links. And if you want to work somewhere in Zalando, we've got pretty much every team opening up their hiring at the moment. Yeah, thank you very much, and happy to take your questions.